So we're back. Christine waits till I start talking before she presses that button. So we're embarking on our final session today. So if you remember, the morning session was about the research piece, the second session was about policy, and this one is really about critical thinking. So I'm going to hand you over to the session chair, Patricia Conboy. Patricia is an adjunct lecturer with the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology based here. Patricia, sorry, it's like as if it was a but. So here's for the good part. You were also a former head of global advocacy and policy at HOMeAGE International, if I've got that title correct. So I'm going to hand you over to Patricia, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Okay. So thank you, Kieran. Can everyone hear me first? Okay. So welcome to all of our colleagues in the room. Welcome to our participants online. I think we had a really wonderful morning, content-rich sessions and very stimulating question and answer sections to follow. And I hope we're going to have more of that to follow this afternoon. The theme of the session is critical thinking and policy and scholarly debates in ageing in place. And our two speakers are Nora Keating and Malcolm Cutchin. Before I introduce Nora as the first speaker, just to alert you to the fact that there's a slight adjustment on the timetable and our coffee break will be at 15:25. We'll have about 20 minutes then, and we'll hear Malcolm after the coffee break. So Nora is going to speak to the theme of making research policy relevant, why your place matters. And Nora is a most distinguished academic. She holds academic appointments at the University of Alberta, Canada, Stirling University in the UK, and Northwest University, South Africa. She's also the director of the IAGG, that is the International Association of Geriatrics and Gerontology, their global social issues on aging initiative. And Nora's research interests are in families and aging, and in the physical and social context that can include or exclude older persons. Welcome, Nora.
Thanks very much, Patricia. This afternoon's talk, what I want to talk to you about is how place has come to matter to me. How I hope for those of you who are the early career researchers here, you will be able to use what I think is a huge advantage that I understand each of you has, and that is that you are doing your doctoral work in a country that's not the country where you were born. And I think that's true of everyone. So what we have is a group here of early career scholars who know places in ways that we don't all know them. You can use that to your advantage, and I'm going to talk to you today about a couple of things. One is my own journey from where you are now to having all these nice titles and global places behind my name. And then to talk with you about how it is that your work might make a difference at that big level, which is the public policy level. You may have heard earlier this morning when Alana Officer from WHO was talking to you, and we asked her, a couple of us, Pamela and I, both asked her questions about how do you make a difference? How do you actually get governments engaged in using the evidence that we're creating? So those are the two things I'd like to talk to you about. I've got a couple of examples from my own work that I've used, I hope, to begin to fill that gap between the evidence and the taking up of the evidence. And just as a caveat to begin, it's taken me quite a few years before I think those who are in a position to really make those policies and programs that make a difference, take them up. So do not be discouraged. it's a journey and you're started on it. And you're in a wonderful setting. I must say, congratulations to you, Kieran, for this network and for what it means to those of us who are at different points in our academic journeys. Kieran has built a wonderful center here that's making a big difference in terms of questions about who's included and who's not, and how place matters. So well done, Kieran, and thank you for including me. So I consider myself these days a global person. I spend time in different parts of the world. There are places where I feel at home and places where I know I'm not, and places where I think I can make some difference, but where people help me understand how their places matter. And that's important to me. I'm a social gerontologist, as most of us are here. I think one cannot understand social until you set yourself in different places. So it is about place, but I won't in any way try to really add to what the scholars who have come before me today have talked about. I hope you know, all you early career people, you've got the who's who of aging and place and gerontological aging right here in the room. So lucky for all of us. Okay, Karen, you promised me. There we go. So how did I get from where I began to here? I'm going to give you the short version of Nora's journey, just so you have some idea. And I must say, people sometimes ask me, how I got to be doing this kind of work that I'm doing in global aging. And the answer is, I know now looking back, but I could not have predicted it looking forward. But as I look now, having been assigned this task of thinking about policy, one of the things I've learned is that, or I've been reminded of, is that I too did my doctoral work in a place that was not the place where I was born. And that set me on a course, I think, of asking the questions and often going, when I observed something that wasn't quite like home. That place where I did my PhD was the United States. I'm from Canada. It was not far from where I had grown up, which is in the central part of Canada. I did my PhD in New York State. It had the same terrible climate, high humidity, hot temperatures in the summer, cold ice and snow in the winter. So the place was familiar, if not pleasant, but so many other things were different. I was on a visa, a student visa, that at that time was called an alien visa. Talk about, feeling at home. But the university worked very hard at making people feel comfortable. And one of the things they did was they'd send out messages when there were particular holidays in the US and invite you to dinners and things like that. And the first one I received was one for a holiday that we know in Canada called Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving, as I knew, is in the middle of October. Well, it wasn't. It was in November. I mean, how odd is that? Until I figured out that this place was further south than the place where I live. And Thanksgiving is a harvest festival. So it was little things like that that make you go, I guess it makes sense, but it's not home. So that PhD in aging and life course led me to an academic position in a department at University of Alberta back in Canada called human ecology. And human ecology is about people and the contexts in which they live their lives. And so place, and that place where I did my work, was also part of my own academic career as I thought about what are the important contexts. And there were two for much of my career. One was families and social connections and how people are set within those really micro environments. But the other was place. I was living and working in a place that had long rural traditions, and I began to do my work in rural aging because of that. The place mattered, and it came with cultural traditions and exciting things that were going on. And I learned then about families and family businesses. And those family businesses were farm businesses in that part of the world. So that's one of those serendipitous things that happen as you go to a place which has opportunities for you to work. Over a number of years, I was fortunate to be in different places, and more I got invited into international places. And I'm going to tell you one more little secret about myself, and then we'll move on to other things. The main reason I got involved in international issues of aging, there were the academic critical ones about wanting to know about places and other cultures, but there was a very practical one. Our university, within a period of about 10 years, went through 3 major restructurings. Those of you who work at universities know what happens is a senior administrator comes in and thinks we've got to do it differently. And so they merge departments and they downsize units and they move people around, and everyone is completely upset and writing briefs for months at a time. And I decided at that point it was either they're going to quit or I was going to lift my head and look elsewhere. And so really that's what got me going to international conferences, deciding that I really was interested in what was going on in other places. And by the time I came back, that restructuring was over and life had settled down. So there's some serendipity. I've learned a lot about place, the place where I live, the places where I visit. And that took me, and that's what I really want to talk to you about today, that took me to a place of thinking there's another context that I really needed to understand. And that context was the policy context, the big societal beliefs and values that really frame so much of our lives and our work and those things we can do and the things we can't do. Oops, let's go the other way here. So here we are, and let me take you on a short journey around policy and place and why your place matters. So I don't need to tell people like you that places come on to international agendas. I think Malcolm, by the way, Malcolm, where are you, Malcolm? He has a brand new, there he is. Malcolm Cutchin has a brand new book about to come out. It may come out before Tina's virtual book that's already out for next year, which is Aging in Place in Urban Environments. She talked to you a bit about it. Malcolm's book that he is going to talk to you about, I think a little bit after mine, is called The Handbook on Aging and Place. And one of the things you need to know is Malcolm is something of a historian. And although places come onto international agendas, in fact, if Aristotle had had social media available to him, he would have been talking about place back then as well. So Malcolm, I don't know whether you're going to talk about history of place being important in people's lives, but it goes back a fairly long way. So congratulations to both of you on these new books, and I hope you all will read them. So many of the things you've heard today and the things you've been reading is how places become important and how it's become important as we understand the lives of older people, communities, Tina's presentation in particular, as communities where people live their lives. I'm going to talk to you about local government and how policy that's close to home is particularly important in crafting those lives. My own work in human ecology and some of the principles in the decade of healthy aging that you heard Alana talk about and work that Frank and others are doing is about person-environment fit. And my favorite story about that is that it really is all about how I may be more or less comfortable, more or less able to do what I wish to do, depending upon what's going on in those environments outside of me. My favorite one is interviewing a man one time who was about to go into a care setting. And so I was talking to him about what kind of place he was looking for. And he said, I don't need much. He said, all I want is a warm bed and a full belly. So for him, fit was a fairly modest set of expectations. But that fit between who I am and what works for me is something I'm particularly conscious of as I travel, and I expect you as PhD students will be as well, because you're going to see this. You're in new places. Kieran, in his work, others as well, talk a lot about communities as places of inequality. I think that's where there's this debate about aging in place versus aging and place. What are those places that can exclude people? How and in what circumstances do they include them? Some of Tina's work was about that. And particularly as fundamental to healthy aging. I don't know, many of you will have read the World Report on Aging and Health. It was quite radical in that health has always been seen as something kind of inside the person. This idea of healthy aging being about well-being, being about doing what you wish to do and what you value was quite radical and new from the traditional health side. Makes perfect sense to us. So, we're researchers. We create evidence about all of these issues. Policy is evidence-based, right? Well, that's the story. So, let me tell you a little bit about the story about how it is that sometimes, despite all the beautiful evidence that we create and that you will create, the people who are doing the public policy work don't always take it up as quickly as we know they should. Don't be discouraged. Okay, so this is about your place. And I want you to be thinking as I'm talking about what is your place when it comes to what I'm going to talk about here, which is public policy, the policies that governments create to make a difference in people's lives, or at least we hope that's why they're creating them. Because policy is grounded in places. And policy, public policy, is layered. There are global places that make a difference, and regional and national and local places. And as we learn about policy, we'll learn about which ones of those are important, depending upon the issue that is of interest. Governments are notorious for developing legislation and programs, but not always being entirely explicit about the agenda. Learning to read between the lines is quite a skill. And it's something I know you can learn to do. I've learned it reasonably well, I think. And the pathways aren't clear. But I'm going to drop you a few breadcrumbs in terms of the pathway I've been on. And sometimes you get invited in. And what I mean by that is sometimes you get invited into the places where they're actually making these decisions and creating the policy, and that can be pretty exciting. And sometimes you just stumble upon it. You meet somebody on an airplane like Patricia, and you talk about issues. So you can always be open to possibilities. I am not trained in social policy. This is my caveat. But I've come to have a set of understandings about policy that are useful for me. So I'm going to give you my definitions of policy and some other policy-related concepts. And you may quote me if you like, and others of you who have more formal training in policy may wish to quibble. But for me, the big item is this one. It's the values and beliefs that frame actions. And we must not underestimate those, because that's sometimes where we think evidence is so clear, it's not taken up. It's because of these values and beliefs. And I think about policy implementation is the actions that governments take, but also their inactions. And that one can be particularly important. We see this huge need. Kieran, in his work, talks about it, and others as well. We talk about social exclusion. We know how people are excluded. Why is there not action? And I think a lot of it comes back to policy. So here's the first question I'd like you, and particularly the early career people, to be thinking about. What places are important to your understanding of policy and policy implementation and policy research? I'll talk about that a little bit. But when you're thinking about making a difference, and I think those of us who work in social gerontology do have that social justice perspective, what places are we talking about? Where do we want to make a difference? Is it here where you're doing your PhD? Is it back home in your home country? Where is it that we're really grounded? So let me tell you a little bit about the layers. I think Alana said 194 countries, so I may have got the number wrong. But the United Nations is a club. And it's a club of this 193 or 194 countries that get together around big, big questions of global peace and so on that are values questions. They don't have any legislative authority. So they can issue reports, they can issue suggestions, they can issue action plans, but they're not binding on the countries who are the signatories to those plans. That helped me understand why a lot of the big UN documents are very grand in their scope, but have very few details. Because if you can imagine getting 194 different players to sign on to something, you've got to keep it pretty macro. That means there's a lot of scope for implementation, and there's equally a lot of scope to not implement. These are the values. They're big, they're ones that many of us embrace. How could anyone, from my point of view, how could anyone not embrace these? But we do see a lot of slippage between these and the implementation later on. So UN is important. It sets these big ideologies and values and beliefs. You heard Alana say that they use persuasion. They use something that I think is somewhat close to shame in terms of, how can we help you get there because you have signed on after all, but no legislative authority. But there are regional governments as well. And these are, I think, particular to two parts of the world. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but the European Union, which has 27 member states, And it has an interesting mix of setting policy priorities, having some legislative authority over some areas. It has 27 member states. The Africa Union has almost twice as many member states. The AU is at, I think, a different place in what's important to that group of states. And for them, there are big priorities right now around post-colonial moving forward, around security, around nations working together. They've got huge challenges ahead of them. And I don't see a lot of legislative authority, but certainly also attempts to persuade around big values. At the national level is where you begin to see what I call the meeting of policy and politics. And I'm going to read you in a minute a little narrative from a friend and colleague of mine who has been in government. He's been a politician for about 30 years, both in local government and provincial government. And he said I could quote him and use his name. I won't necessarily give you his email address, but he's been quite candid about how policy and politics mix. And that's where knowing what place you're thinking about nationally or regionally is really important, because those differ a lot depending upon where you are. And then many places, certainly my country of Canada, many other countries will also have state or provincial governments that may add a different layer of policy priorities. In Canada, we have a very complex system of federal government, 13 provincial and territorial governments, each of which have their premiers, each of whom has a different political background. Money flows into the central government, it flows into provincial governments, and the spats about who has priority over money and being able to implement policy can be quite immense. But let me see if I could find here what Brian had to say. Okay. And then we have local authorities or communities, and that's where policy is most immediate, where people are living. It can have a big impact on people's lives, but local authorities also are subject to those broader ideologies. So here's a little narrative from my colleague. He says, in my municipal experience, meaning local government, ideological factors were somewhat less than in the provincial sphere. First, there was a political culture of non-partisanship. So think about that in your own local governments. Are people running on a kind of party politics plank or not? There were periods, and candidates didn't run under party banners or slates. All city councillors, however, he said, were ideological. So they all actually were members of political parties at the provincial or national level. So there's this interesting tension around what were their values and beliefs. They were publicly one thing, but perhaps privately another. He also said, and I don't think this is true everywhere, he said the scope of municipal government largely determined the role that ideology played. The local government are focused on two things: land use and services to property. So the conflicts were around, do we build social housing or do we build a golf course? They were conflicts around whether or not we wanted development. So a lot of it was around housing and infrastructure. When you get to provincial politics, he said, in the provincial politics, it's more overtly ideological, and individual members are much less independent. So in the provincial system in Canada, you must adhere to the party politics with your own pronouncements and so on. And he says that mostly ministers of the government that had too much independence were reined in. Is anybody here from Britain? Okay, with my apologies to you, this is my friend. I'm putting this in quote. Only the British could have concocted, and he's talking about the parliamentary system, such a convoluted yet highly centralized system. I think the important point is that we are, what we can do as researchers, what older people can do in terms of the options in their lives, really are determined by some of these layers of government and their beliefs. So if you want to find out about these, do a little searching. There are people writing about the dominant ideologies in a region. These are a few recent examples of articles that have been written, often very critical, critical both in the sense of analytic and critical in the sense of negative. Except when it comes to Ireland, which really, I guess, sense that people are searching for problems in Ireland, and maybe I'm wrong. But I read this sustainable governance indicator that rated Ireland as 97 out of 100. Now, there are some more critical pieces, and I understand where Kieran's work and some of the others of you from Ireland are doing work on housing and doing work on travelers and excluded peoples. But I'd say you get a pretty good score here in Ireland. So maybe it's time to move on to Canada in terms of your social exclusion research, Kieran. Okay. So these are the three big questions that for me come up quite a lot of the time. And maybe we can pause just for 2 or 3 minutes, and particularly with the early career people. How am I doing for time? Yeah, well, how much time? Okay, good. If you were thinking about the places that are going to be important to you, if you wanted your research to have an impact, do you have a sense of what those are? Are they here where you're doing your work? Are they there, which is your home country? Are they somewhere else? Do you have any sense of that? Anybody? Like, why are you here? You came to a country, well, you're not here, but you came to a country outside of your own. So what are the places that are going to be important that you want to influence? That 10 years from now, when you're giving this talk, you can say, I've made a difference in this place with this policy. Anybody? Not hearing. All right, I'll come back to it a little. Yes. Oh, okay. So it's a specific community. So you mean a community within a country, or a community broadly of people who share interests?
For example,
Okay, that's really interesting. So when you're talking about place, you're talking about a place where there are others like me, and where there are communities of people. And that's a different, and that's right, that's a different kind of place. So you'd be looking for the kind of policy development that would be more inclusive of people who are queer, people who otherwise in many countries are excluded. And that cuts across physical places. Yeah, good point. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think from the perspective of a new generation, it does tend to be a lot more localized. Like once I know which kind of communities I'm looking at, is to be very much a place-based local places. But in the UK, there are also really big connections to charities like Shelter, organisations, and lots of networks of advocacy that take things from a kind of Greater Manchester perspective and take them to the like regional and then national levels. So
Yeah, I think that's interesting. You know, one approach that we often take in our own research is to do our research that's grounded in a physical place, community. And what I'd encourage you to do, and it's not always so easy, is to see whether you can take some of the principles about what you learn up to those broader policy areas, because sometimes our local research doesn't get the spread that we'd like it to. So that's an interesting point. So I'm going to leave the other two questions for now, because they're big ones around values. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the things I've learned about those major values and how I've started to use them in my own work. And then if we have time, we'll come back to these. Those, the list at the bottom, I began to make a list of the countries that people are from. And I don't know that I've got them all, but I mean, it just is going to make for a very rich group. So well done to all of you who've chosen you, the early career scholars, to be here. No pressure. So Alana, in her presentation this morning, and Tina in hers, talked about the UN Decade of Healthy Aging. And in our milieu, that's a hugely important document. It sets what I've called the moral compass for where we need to go on issues of aging. So it's important, it's a touch point for us in talking about the work we're doing and why it's important. And I would encourage you, if you haven't looked at it, the WHO website has all those documents on it, but this is a big one. And because we're just fairly early days in this decade that goes to 2030, your work can and should, I hope, contribute to that decade of healthy aging. One of the big questions that must be asked is, how do we know when we get there? So these are the actions that Alana talked about. So a big report was written kind of about the state of aging in the world, and then it followed with, remember, 193 countries, it followed with the actions that she talked about. Now think about where these have come from. Then I'm going to give you two examples of actions that I've been working on in terms of setting research agendas. So from that student who started her PhD in another country, as I've done my work over the years, I've begun to think about how we can develop research agendas around some of these big, big questions. Because there's no research agenda that's set out in these actions. They're big signposts that don't tell you how to get there. And I'm a practical researcher theorist. I want to have a pathway to get there. So Alana talked a lot about how people think, feel, and act towards age and aging. A lot of the early work on aging was very negative. It was about dependence. There were terms when we were first talking about aging 10 or 15 years ago, we talked about things like gray tsunami. I mean, isn't that a positive view of aging? So how do you change views of aging? How do you change language? It's still there. Watch your language. Watch the language of others as they talk about aging. It's a big one. The Age-Friendly Communities Initiative comes very much out of that second action, and I'm going to talk to you about a research project that I've done with some colleagues, I think at least one of whom is online today, around communities fostering the abilities of older people. It's back to communities being places where people live. The person-centered integrated care and primary health services, those are often within the acute care sector. In some parts of the world, like for those of us in the global north, they are pretty well developed. In some parts of the world, the resources aren't there to really develop those primary health care systems. And when they're developed, often older people are, if not formally excluded, don't really have the same access to those. Access to long-term care for older people is an important one. There's a clause in that, and Alana talked about that as well. There's a clause in that agenda that's been particularly relevant in my work, and that is that families should not be held responsible for care. Now, that's a big line in that report. And for someone who does work on families and care, that's really resonated with me. That sounds just fine. You heard the presentation this morning about welfare states and where families are expected to take on the role of care and support of older adults and where they're not. That's the kind of agenda we're talking about. So I wrote an article last year around these questions, and what would we, and I wrote it for researchers, what do we as researchers, how do we take on these big action items and begin to make them researchable and then think about the policy implications of them? So I've got a couple of examples for you of pieces of work I've done recently with colleagues. One is the Action 2. The other one is Action 4 around long-term care. So, ensure that communities foster the abilities of older people. Tina alluded to one of the issues that hasn't necessarily been front and center in the age-friendly communities agenda, and that is, well, what's the capacity of communities to actually do these things? And this research for me was prompted by an encounter I had with a colleague in South Africa a few years ago. And it was when the age-friendly movement was really beginning to take off, but it wasn't taking off so much in Southern Africa. And he was driving with me through one of the what would have been an apartheid settlement. And people were living in very poor circumstances with insecure housing and services. And he looked down this road and he turned to me and he said, "So, what's age-friendly here?" And I remembered that comment. It just didn't, the term didn't make sense to him. With a whole communities of people who were just excluded. And so one of the things I did was to work with a group of people who are, most of them early career scholars, to get a sense of what are the capacities of communities to actually be age-friendly. We focused on the Global South. We brought in scholars from Latin America and South Africa who spoke all of these languages because we wanted to do our review of the work that was done in the places. And what we found is in these communities in the Global South, often there was real exclusion both of communities who simply didn't have the services, couldn't provide them, were often physically isolated and didn't have infrastructure or the ability to move people to services that were elsewhere. There were many indigenous cultures where people were marginalized within their own communities because of language and culture. So it's a piece of work that I hope we will take forward and think more about age-friendly and other ways into thinking about communities. The other piece that I'm working on right now with colleagues at Statistics Canada is one in which we're looking at this whole question of long-term care. And I think it was Alana said, we really don't know enough about who's doing the care, who's benefiting from it, what its costs and benefits are. And that's the work I'm doing with Statistics Canada. So we're developing a framework around family scholars, not family scholars, family carers, paid carers, what they do, what's the economic value of their work, and although I don't always like that return on investment, what's the return on investment to a country by paying paid carers a reasonable wage and by providing supports to family carers so they don't have to lose their jobs or give up their own futures in order to provide care. Stay tuned for that one. It's in process. So some things for you to think about as you think about how your own work is going to make a difference. Ask those questions. How does place matter to you? What is your place? How much of your work is going to be global? How much of it will be focused on Europe? If you're from outside of Europe, will it be more focused there? You may not know the answer to that question right now, but it's one I think you need to think about. Be open to opportunities. My probably biggest policy coup in terms of actually having an impact on policy happened at a university event where I was, I had just gotten a big research award, and the Minister of Veterans Affairs, it was to do research with veterans and aging, was there. And we had this lunch, and on his way out to the car, he said, "So, should I change that policy about supporting family members who are caring for veterans?" And I said, "Yes." And he got into his car, and it happened. Now, that's once in 30 years, but look for your opportunities. And start here. There's a great group of people around you. I know you've all been talking to each other. I'm sorry that you who are out there online are not here, because it's those conversations that you have with one another. You're building a cohort. Those of you who are in this program, we're all here. And I think most of us are pretty darn approachable. So talk to us, talk to each other. And 10 years from now, when Kieran is organizing yet another one of these big events, I'll expect to see one or more of you, I'm looking at these early career people, on the podium telling us about how your work has made a difference. So thank you all, and I will turn it back to you, Patricia.
Okay. So to thank Nora very, very much for being so candid about the challenges of moving from the research to the policy arena, the difficulties of policy pathways, but also for sharing so generously from your own experience over the course of such a fruitful career. And whilst our time is limited, we do have a few minutes for questions. If anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment while we have Nora with us. So I'll just give a couple of moments for that. And if I could ask you just to give us your first name when you're speaking for the benefit of. Okay.
Thank you. I'm one of the researchers. When you asked how place matters to us, I was immediately thinking about positionality, so social location and not necessarily the physical location.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about this a lot, like how students and in relation to participants, or my decision in relation to generating knowledge and theory, but not so much in relation to how to communicate. Research without technology development research, so that's I have a master's before, and I was wondering how do you think positionality matters when it comes to policy relevant research and research communication?
Well, it matters. One of the things that someone said this morning was look for policy windows. So when there's a conversation that's going on, and I think these, because if we're thinking about policy, those are place-based in terms of physical places. if there's a conversation going on about the issue that's really relevant to you, and the conversation is going on nationally or locally, or there's a particular government person who's taken it on in a way that you think you could inform, take that opportunity to have the conversation. So you watch for those. So that's one of the ways you can do it. I think just watch for those opportunities to have a conversation. It can be so discouraging otherwise. I once had someone come to me, and this was about care in this case, and she said, what else can we do? You know, we've done this research, we've brought in carers, we've had the conversations, we've written the reports. What else can we do to have somebody who can make a difference take it up? And at the point at which they were set in that place where there was a very conservative government, I couldn't think of much else. I mean, I really couldn't. The opportunity wasn't there. So it's looking for, it's listening, it's reading these kinds of documents, it's figuring out where there's an opportunity in terms of the values and beliefs that you can get in. Because if the door doesn't open, you just can't make a difference. I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's part of it.
So, and we have another question behind. Thank you.
No, it was just what you were saying about policy windows, and it reminded me of the session yesterday about open science. And I think that one of the things is when we're working with communities, lots of us are for research and connected organizations, maybe making those organizations aware of all the resources that we know are out there. So that when we do put things on the European Open Science Portal and different things, activists and advocates also have access to those things, because they might have more creative methods to use them than we have. They have better skills in lots of ways than we might have. So I guess that might be one of the ways forward compared to that.
And I would say never underestimate the power of networks. Where you can get to these international meetings, meet people doing similar work, talk to people who are working on the issue that's relevant to you, but are doing it from within an advocacy setting or a social service setting or a government setting. Because what you want is for someone who's maybe, you know, developing some kind of policy or program to say, oh, I know someone who could help us out with that. It really makes a huge difference. I tell my women students that there's nothing like an old girls network to make things happen. So my apologies to the others of you, but it makes a difference. So both those things, but do them together, because otherwise people won't notice. Frankly, you know, we put things up on those portals, and they are important, but unless somebody knows you, they're less likely to contact you. So you're doing the right thing by being in this program.
I think, are there any final comments or questions before we wrap up this part of the session? Oh, Pamela,
Of
beg your
course,
pardon.
Pamela.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Okay, let's go ahead.
Okay, Laura, when you were talking about the government priorities, right? The different levels influencing those priorities. I'm thinking about a place that I want to influence, it is Latin America. And countries where those priorities are set by non-political actors like the private sector. So I wanted to see your perspective on that, and if there's avenues for collaboration also with this sector, and you know, what do you think? How do you think we could deal? This,
That's a whole other talk, Pamela, but it's an interesting question because one of the things you're suggesting is there are some places where, you know, it might be the NGO sector, it might be the private sector that in fact are having a big influence on an agenda that's important to you. So those are the people that you really want to meet. Sometimes, I don't know whether there are opportunities within this program in terms of people's placements to be placed in the private sector I mean, I don't know whether there are opportunities there, but if that's something that interests you, I would ask about it now that I mean, are there those opportunities, Kieran? If somebody, somebody doing one of their, what are they're not internships exactly, but they secondments.
I think there's a couple of people that might.
Yeah, so look for those. That would be a good place to start, because then you've got some credentials. The next time you want to do something, you don't want to do something in Latin America. So it's a good start. And get your power suit,
Okay, so I think we will thank Nora, thank all of you again for your attention and for your questions. Thank our colleagues online, and I think we should aim to come back at 5. Maybe is 10 to 4 enough, or do I need to go to 5 to 4? 5 to, okay, so we say 5 to 4. So 5 to 4 back from the coffee break, and then we'll be listening to Malcolm. Thanks very much. And thank you, Nora. That's your appreciation. Thanks so much.
Just move that. And I'm going to get rid of
Okay. So, hello again, everyone. It has been a marathon, but the finishing line is in sight. Between us and the finishing line, we have Malcolm Cutchin, who is the Professor and Director of Research at the School of Occupational Therapy in Pacific Northwest University of Health Sciences in USA. And Malcolm is going to speak to us on the theme of critical issues in research on aging in place, a geographical gerontologist perspective. And I know that he has, from the discussion we had at lunchtime, lots of interesting ideas that he hopes that the doctoral students will play with and connect in terms of what he has to say and what you've heard earlier in the day. So welcome, Malcolm.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there. It has been a long day. It's not easy to go last, but hopefully there'll be a few new ideas, but I'm going to connect, I think, quite a bit to the earlier talks. And I just want to say thank you, Kieran, and everyone else with HOMeAGE for including me in this program. It's incredibly exciting. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm going to be very pedagogical to begin with, and we were asked to write learning objectives. So I'm going to remind you what mine are this afternoon. I hope that you will learn DRs, a few key geographical ideas, or if you already are familiar with them, think about them a little differently. I also want you to begin thinking how these might fit into your projects. If any of them do, then that's a great win for me. And then I'm going to tell you about resources that you can read, where you can read more about the ideas that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk first about geographical gerontology and the unique perspective I think it brings to gerontology in general, but how it also dovetails with what Frank talked about this morning to a certain extent. And then I have selected 5 themes that are of interest to me, but I think are really relevant, current, and provide a great opportunity for your future work, where you can contribute not only in the domains that you've scoped out and you're targeting for your dissertations, but I think there are other contributions potentially to make, because you're all studying aging in place, and these themes are tied in to aging in place. And then I'll draw a few conclusions and hopefully wrap it up on time. So I'm to use the mouse to go forward. arrows aren't,
So I'd say it's just tag it again and we go here.
okay, thanks. All right, so this new book that's forthcoming has already been plugged, but I wanted to be honest that up front that I'm drawing from not exclusively, but a lot of the things I want to talk about today are in this book. It's going to be published early next year. The publisher says diverse leaders in the field are included in the book. I'm going to show you the table of contents here in a moment, but some of the key chapters are authored by people in the auditorium this afternoon. So I think it potentially is going to be a great resource for you because it really ties into the sort of work that you're doing. So 23 chapters, and I've highlighted those that are involved in the program. So after the introduction by Graham Rolls and myself, and by the way, you've probably noticed Graham Rolls has been cited in half the presentation so far. He's sort of a giant in the field. And I'm very proud to say I was his first PhD student. So that dates me back a ways because Graham has been doing this work for almost 50 years now. But it was really an exciting opportunity for us to collaborate together and to bring all these leaders together into this one volume and try to capture the state of the art of aging in place across a wide array of different types of gerontology. So we have a major section on perspectives on aging in place. So these are more theoretical, conceptual sort of framings of aging in place. Gavin Andrews, I think, is probably the leading geographical gerontologist from Canada. And that's a great theoretical chapter. I'll mention it a couple of times, but Frank and his colleagues, fantastic chapter on environmental gerontology. Kieran, I'm going to talk about both of their works later on this afternoon. A number of other leaders in the field. Then the core places of aging, and I'm going to bring in some of these chapters into the talk. We have a couple of chapters on home. Then we go to the third places, neighborhoods, cities, and rural places. And then we move to a set of chapters, contributions about making and remaking places. And this really ties into the sort of things that Tina talked about. For example, Keith Diaz-Moore has been cited several times so far in this conference. And Suzanne is on the international expert panel as well. And so is Vanessa Burhold. So although we can't cover everything in one volume, I think this is really a nice, extensive set of very in-depth sort of synthetic works. Each chapter averages almost 10,000 words. So this is a big book, a lot of depth, a lot of wonderful references and citations included. So this morning we started off with a talk by Frank about environmental gerontology and its evolution over the last few decades and the three generations of contributions and the enduring and novel perspectives that it has addressed and continues to address going forward. And as Frank talked about, environmental gerontology has really been led by psychologists over the decades. They have really dominated that approach. It has evolved a lot over the last 20 years. And the way I like to counterpose geographical gerontology with environmental gerontology is that environmental gerontology, because of its psychological roots and the dominance of psychologists in the field, it tends to focus on human development in the individual or groups in an environmental context, where geographical gerontology tends to be dominated, but not wholly, by geographers. And so we tend to focus on place or foreground place first and think about the way place and space affects people within an aging context. So they're really flip sides of the same coin. And the little Venn diagram there is to illustrate there is a lot of overlap A lot of people that would say, I'm a geographical gerontologist, have contributed to environmental gerontology and vice versa. It really is just a difference in emphasis, but I think the viewpoints of both fields have been converging more and more over time and are really developing some synergy going forward. And that's an exciting and positive thing. So if you haven't heard of geographical gerontology before, and it is a relatively new term, really, we those of us that have been involved in fostering this as a distinct domain of gerontology really didn't start calling it that until about 15 years ago. And Gavin Andrews, again, is a key leader in that. But it did exist. Looking at the work of geographers Stephen Gallant, Graham Rolls, and Tony Warnes in particular back in the 70s. So it comes out in the 70s. It's not very large. It's not large compared to environmental gerontology at that time, but focusing distinctively on spatial behavior, meaning of place, population, aging, and migration as sort of good examples of what was going on for the first couple of decades. But since the turn of the century, there's really have been a new cohort of scholars and really a couple of generations of scholars that developed new theories, new concepts, new methods, and really brought a lot of great new energy to the field. And I edited a book with Gavin Andrews and Mark Skinner that was published 5 years ago called Geographical Gerontology: Perspectives, Concepts, and Approaches. And we tried to distill really kind of what the essence of that work was at that time and where it was going and what contributions it can make above and beyond environmental gerontology, but really we see it as a complement. In the second chapter in our handbook on aging in place, Gavin really expands the understanding of that and talks about place, knowing place in 5 different ways, and the evolution of the concept of place in geography and in geographical gerontology. So Graham Rolls, being really the one of the first geographical gerontologists, has had a profound effect on the field. And we've already heard today about his concepts of insideness, physical, autobiographical, and social insideness. He's written a lot on home, on place attachment. And where he's landed at this point in time is being in place, which really is including a lot of those prior concepts that he developed into a larger construct, for lack of a better term. And I'll talk about that again briefly. But this new generation of geographical gerontologists really started to think about place differently than Graham did. And it's not that it's better than Graham's vision. And we'll see that Graham has kind of merged his view into some of this new thinking. But Janine Wiles's work from 2005 is really, I think, an excellent example of this new way of thinking about place, a more dynamic, more critical way of thinking about place. And the most important thing, I think, for you to take from this is that she makes a compelling argument, and I agree with all of her points here, that place is a process. It's not a thing. Even though other geographers and other social scientists that work with the concept of place know that place is multifaceted, physical, social, cultural, and so on, this is a different way to think about place. It is always an evolution, always changing, always in motion, always undetermined. And then she expands that by stating that places, and especially our relationships with them, are subject to negotiation. That is, we have not only a relationship, but a way to demand something of place or be pushed by place and try to adapt and adjust to places. Places are contested because we all experience even the same place differently and have different ideas about what place should become in the future. The place is full of power relations, and those power relations are expressed through those places and shape places, and those people living in places. Places are not just separate processes, they're interrelated to other places and other processes at different times and at different scales. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, places are material and physical, symbolic, social, and we could add a bunch of different layers in there. So in sum, place is incredibly complex. It's hard to pin down, it's complex, but it's dynamic. So that's sort of where we find ourselves, generally speaking, nowadays in terms of geographical gerontology. These 5 points are ones that I think are interesting I wanted to talk about today. And Frank talked about relational thinking and relational theory this morning. So I'm just going to really add a couple of new ideas to what he already said. And I'm going to shamelessly say that one of the new ways of thinking, relatively new, it's been in development for 20 plus years now, but one of the relational theories that is used is from pragmatism, and John Dewey's pragmatism in particular. And I call this a place integration perspective. Graham and I have a chapter 9 on this, and it's really using Dewey's theory to propose how people or communities re-coordinate their relationship with place as the person-place situation evolves over time. Again, the dynamic relationship, there's an ebb and flow to it. This view eschews dualism. So again, as Frank introduced this morning, the co-constitution of person and place is a central component of this theory. There's a bunch of other concepts that are quite unique to this way of thinking. The transactional perspective, which is based on Dewey's thinking, quite distinct and complex. The functional coordination of person and place, that we try to re-coordinate with place as things change to maximize function and well-being. Habits, inquiry, imagination, and harmony and disharmony. These are all sort of interesting ideas. I don't have time to elaborate on exactly what each means, but they're sort of novel in the sense that, for example, imagination is not really central to any of the other sort of theories that are being used in environmental gerontology, as far as I know. A chief motif that I think is valuable in this perspective is that of meliorism. And this comes from the 19th century origins of pragmatism, and that is that there's always this sort of ethic of the need to better the situations of people, and in this sense of older adults in their places. And that's the value of having theory, is to keep us on task and to try to do that through inquiry. So Graham and I have posed in this chapter that our related perspectives, his being in place and mine the place integration perspective, are interventional as well as being theoretical. And here's a diagram about how we try to merge and understand how our perspectives work together. And this is the ongoing cycle of place integration and being in place, where we start with a harmonious relationship, hopefully, of person and place, but something changes, and it always will change. It's either a change in the person, a change in the place, or something about the relationship between the two that necessitates working through place integration processes with the goal of alleviating the disharmony and trying to arrive at harmony again. So these processes of using habits, using social inquiry and imagination to try to resolve the issue, to change something, to develop harmony, starts to develop being in place. It starts to develop that insideness of place identification, to rectify the situation, to move the person-place situation back towards harmony. But then again, it's going to start sometime in the future because there's going to be some disruption, some change that necessitates the process to begin all over again. But Graham and I suggest that there are points at which we can intervene, and we've proposed examples of how you can use these principles of this perspective to actually intervene into different types of places, whether it be at the level of home, care environments, or in the community. I did want to mention here that I think a closely related perspective that comes from a different philosophical background is that's introduced in chapter 3 by Anna Vanka, Frank's mentee and colleague now, using the philosophy of Deleuze and actor network theory. She argues that their perspective is about doing of aging in place as a practice. So this is definitely more of a sociological perspective. I think it's very valuable. It's very exciting. And I was glad to see that she's really producing a lot of new work on this. I think it's going to be of great use to many people. So the key ideas here are that aging identities and meaning making happens in and through materialities, bodies, things, and places. It's a different way of thinking, but it brings the material world, the non-human world, into assemblages that can help us understand aging in place, that are working together and always remaking and continuously making place and that assemblage. So this is a relational process ontology of becoming with, as they say, implying that all phenomena are continuously in the making. And you can see the parallels there with the process sort of thinking of Janine Wiles and of pragmatism. And I think these are aligned perspectives that are potentially very useful. So multiscalar perspectives and analysis. Now you've heard Kieran say several times during the course of this event, multiscalar, scalar. This is something I guess that many of you are familiar with. But as a geographer, I don't know. I don't know for sure what you know about that. So I just want to go through it very briefly. I think scale is a very powerful and important idea within geographical gerontology and geography as well. So at one level, we think about scale as meaning different units of analysis, scales, that are nested within each other. And those scales or units of analysis could be different places. And we often think about the home being nested within the neighborhood, being nested within the community, within the city, within the region, within the country, whatever. We can keep going, right, to the global level. But they're more than that, because we have to consider what's happening at those scales, what processes are at work at each scale that are going to affect each other if we're thinking about home being related to neighborhood and so on. Now, we often think that we're dealing with that when we're doing, for example, multi-level regression models where we can control for the effects or control for covariates to see the effect of, say, the neighborhood on an individual when we look at, for example, health geographies at the neighborhood level. But it's more than that, because we really need to think about the dynamic relationship of those scales as they work together to do that. And we can't really get at that with multi-level models, because that's typically cross-sectional, and it takes more than that to really understand what's going on if we're interested in change. So there's another level here, and that is at any scale, we've got multiple things happening that have to be layered in to our account of place and how places at one scale relate to another. And I'm going to show some images here to try to get these ideas across. But these aren't just methodological anomalies or ideas that geographers are interested in. This stuff is really important to all types of gerontological work: policy, cultural issues, economic dimensions, and so on. So these images didn't come out that great, but again, at the most basic level, thinking about different scales is just like zooming in and zooming out on a map. When you're using, say, Google Maps on your phone and you zoom in and zoom out, you're changing scale, you're changing perspective. And geographers use scale originally to talk about the fraction that 1 unit equals 2,000 kilometers on the first map on the left, 500 in the middle one, and 200 on the one on the right. But we tend to think about scale and talk about it as the first map on the left being large scale. It's a larger area. So that's zooming in and zooming out. But it becomes more meaningful when we think about the units of analysis being, for example, jurisdictional units where data are collected. Because then we can think about scales of analysis being at the local level data, regional level data, national level data, and so on, because they're all relevant to any individual or group that we're studying, right? They all have an effect. And we've heard about policy today being important. Yeah, national policy is important, but how does it flow down to the local level? When we use units of analysis or scales of places like these, we can start to tease out those effects and understand better about how those larger scales are affecting smaller scales and so on. Here's the other complexity. Even if we're thinking about one scale of analysis, we've always got multiple variables to be thinking about, but they may not be collected at the same scale, even within that place. So here's an example where the biophysical characteristics are much more fine-grained in terms of the data versus climate and economy, which are really sort of flat and there's just one unit there. So it becomes something to consider in your analyses going forward, try to leverage different perspectives of different scales and an analysis in your studies. But I want to throw a twist here, and here's the really new idea probably for many of you. And even though this idea is about 10 years old, there's very little research that's used it yet. So here's the idea. Underlying whatever number of scales we might be attending to is spatial behavior. We move across scales on a daily basis. We are engaged in different places for different periods of time from day to day, which change from day to day and week to week. And there's some constancy there as well. So this work by Matthews and Yang, I think, is really important because it does a few things that I think propose some radical ideas about the way we could think about aging and places differently. First of all, it suggests that exposures or an exposure perspective is important. That is, that we're exposed to positive and negative things in our environments or places on an ongoing basis. And people that study health outcomes in neighborhoods, for example, get this. We think that disadvantaged neighborhoods have many more stressors that we're exposed to that then get under the skin, so to speak, and cause negative sort of outcomes in terms of mental health or physical health. So here, they argue that traditional studies of place all too easily ignore the non-residential neighborhoods and places that people are exposed to during their daily activities. Meaning that if you're still working and you're older, it's not just the home that's important. It's the work environment also that we need to capture, and we need to understand how that environment is tied to the other environments that we're spending time in. So they recommend an activity space framework and attention to the definition of place and consideration of the scales of analysis to bring those different exposures into the picture. So considering the multitude of places, that is spatial polygamy, the multitude of places that we're exposed to on an ongoing basis, even as older adults, are relevant to social and health outcomes. And we need to focus on improving our knowledge on how these places overlap in time and space. And that's a real challenge methodologically, but it's a challenge that we should take up. All right, engagement and participation of older people with place. So I want to talk a little bit here about the places and the types of engagement and the benefits of engagement and participation for older people. And I think, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this area was really underdeveloped. And I think that's changed a lot. And we've heard that in some of the presentations today so far. Originally, there was just a lot of volunteerism as the sort of key point of engagement for retired older people. And I think that was oversimplified and it minimized the role of places in the daily lives of older adults. And the fields of occupational therapy and occupational science, among others, have really brought our attention to daily activities and different types of engagement and participation with places. We now know that that is very important. And of course, the age-friendly cities movement, as we heard, is all about trying to provide opportunities for engagement and participation. And this occurs in subtle and multifaceted ways, and it happens across different scales. So I'm trying to connect the different themes here to one another. It connects to third places, connects to neighborhoods, and it connects to engagement and participation in cities. So chapter 12 in the forthcoming book is by Jessica Finlay, a real shining star, a new star on the scene in social gerontology, and her co-authors. And again, hat tip to Tina for introducing and talking about this idea this afternoon. She already said it, that third places, and I think you used a different term, Tina, but we're talking about the same thing here: public institutions, libraries, parks, community organizations, churches, civic associations, and so on, and commercial establishments are very important here. So bookstores, cafes, barbershops, many other examples. And this is where older people get together, hang out, talk, support one another, and really establish an important type of belonging. And while many, and I think this is an important point that Jessica and her co-authors say, we believe that these are really important. We have pretty good evidence that these places and spaces are very important, but they also can cut the other direction and can deepen and extend socio-political divisions and inequalities of different types that we find in our societies. So they suggest that we need a lot more work on this topic. I was really happy to hear about Sophie Yarker's new book. I wasn't aware of it. That we're just beginning to do substantial work in this area. So this is a fruitful area for future inquiry. I'm very interested in neighborhoods as well. I've done more work on neighborhoods as stressors and their impacts on physical and mental health of older adults, especially Black older adults in the United States. But there's a lot of great work being done. And I think another rising star, and that's one of the great things about being able to do a book, is to include these people or their up and comers and make sure they get a voice in the conversation. Carrie Hand, who comes from occupational therapy, but is publishing in gerontology as well, and her co-author, Catherine Begonesse. They're from Canada, by the way. Their chapter, I think, is brilliant. And they suggest, among other things, that there are several really important ways to conceive of neighborhoods. There's the sort of traditional way to think about neighborhoods as spatial, that is sort of people's neighborhood boundaries, informal neighborhood boundaries are sort of set by mobility more than anything else. So it's really who you can interact with based on your ability to get around in the space outside of your home. But there are also social neighborhoods. Where are the people in the groups that you interact with that are important to you? They also talk about the landmark neighborhood, which is thinking more about the cultural and physical features of the neighborhood that establish where you like to be and where you like to be engaged. An activity-based neighborhood really uses that activity space concept about where do you go and spend your time? Where are the places that define the larger sort of space that we would call a neighborhood? So I like that they give us multiple ways to think about and use the neighborhood concept. But they also make some important sort of theoretical arguments that engagement in one's neighborhood is at the same time enacted and embodied and experienced. I'm going to talk about embodiment a little more in the future, but Carrie is interested in meaningful activities because that's what occupational therapy is all about, is allowing people to be meaningfully active in the things that they want to do on a regular basis. And that when people are able to get out of their home into the neighborhood and do those things, they're enacting and constructing their own identity. And that's a really good thing personally for them, but they're also co-constructing the neighborhood with other people in their neighborhood. So it's bigger than the person. They're actually shaping their world, their life worlds in those neighborhoods, and they're enabled to do that in the way that they think makes an impact for others and for themselves. So they powerfully affect their own neighborhoods for the better. So they argue that the way we can do more research on this is to use a range of sort of novel multi-method techniques that allow us to understand the dynamism and the situatedness of the neighborhood experience for older adults. So I think that's a very interesting and important contribution in our book. Finally, and I cannot do justice to this chapter, it's excellent. I think Tina has presented a lot of the key ideas in their chapter, but what I want to pull out of the chapter that Chris Phillipson and Tina and their co-authors add to the conversation, especially near the end of their chapter, is a different type of engagement. And that is something we've been talking about in this meeting, and that is giving older people a voice in the conversation about what urban space should become. Empowering them because they're too often invisible in the big movements that we think are capable of reshaping cities to be more age-friendly. And they make a key point here that we don't really know very well yet how to do that, and that we need to experiment with participatory and collaborative approaches to allow older adults to be co-producers of urban space. And I love this quote from their chapter: "The success of communities in becoming more age-friendly will, to a large extent, depend on whether older people, including those currently facing social exclusion, will be involved as key actors in setting the agenda for future research and policies on age-friendly developments." So this is very much in tune with having the reference group here, with what this whole program is about. And I really like the idea of we have to experiment. We're going to have to figure this out. We're going to have to try, and we're going to have to disseminate what we find about working with older adults in the community in our projects that are trying to reshape urban space. Okay, habits, embodiment, and emplacement. I think even though I've been working with the concept of habit, which again comes from John Dewey's work, He published a book in 1922, so we're going way back, 101 years ago, called Human Nature and Conduct, where he set out a very rich theory of habit and how important it is, not only in individual life, but in social life. And so we're trying to bring this more into social gerontology and geographical gerontology because we think it's very important. And his definition of habits is basically that they are predispositions of response to an environment or a place. And these predispositions are taken up by each of us because of our exposure and engagement with places over the entire life course, from the day we're born onward. And so these predispositions of action and thought are actually embodied by us. We don't know that they're there, but they're in action in all thought and all behavior all the time. They're not just routinized behaviors. They inform language, the use of language. For example, right now I'm employing a lot of different habits, but habits can be changed and new ones can be formed. And we think that interventions can help older adults do that, to be able to use habits, as we all do, as tools in our individual and collective toolboxes to be better at engaging with place and all the ways that people engage with place, including being imaginative and creative when we're challenged with change. Another chapter in our book by Habib Chowdhury and his collaborators is focused on dementia, but it's focused on thinking about dementia and place differently than we have before, and really trying to come up with novel approaches that are going to be more realistic, especially as people live in the community with dementia. So I like that they're really, he and his colleagues are really forward thinking here and understanding that dementia care is in the future going to be much more in the community than in dementia care settings in aging and assisted living places or other sort of formal care places. And they make an argument that the concepts of embodiment and emplacement are essential here, but they say that emplacement is a more useful concept because it really brings the ecology of being in a place to bear on the issue of dementia and dementia care, where embodiment is really individual focused. So they're pushing us to think more about the mind-body environment relationship as being essential to thinking about dementia. And they make the point that human cognition for us and for those with dementia is mediated by place experience, and that all of our sensory motor interactions in the environment are what forms the way we think. And that's true for you and I, as well as those with cognitive issues. So it's not just care places. Places in the community set the stage for all of that to happen. And that's where we need to be thinking about dementia care going forward. So using the concept of emplacement, social citizenship, and placemaking will lead, they suggest, to more inclusive and positive places for those with dementia. So I think that's a really powerful sort of argument, and they bring a lot of literature to bear in the course of that chapter. So finally, I'll talk a little bit about the life course of people and the life course of place together. So our own Karen Walsh authored chapter 4. And when Graham and I were thinking about this book, we said we have to have a chapter on the life course, but we don't want just the regular sort of chapter on the life course. We want one that will take the next step and fill the big gap in life course studies, which is bringing place fully into the conversation about what does it mean to understand the life course. And because, I've had conversations, I don't call myself a life course scholar. I haven't been trained in that. I haven't done a lot of work with the life course perspective per se. But I've talked to people who do, and they have said, yeah, that's the one weakness. So we knew one person that we thought could pull it off. And luckily, he said yes. And I'm really grateful because this is quite a contribution. And I'm still, I've read this chapter half a dozen times now, and I'm still trying to get it all into my brain. But he makes a key argument here that we have not done a sustained and comprehensive empirical investigation on the relationship between the life course and place, but that we need to. And the four key premises Kieran sets out is that early life experiences inform everything about later experience with place, how people view, prioritize, and relate to place the rest of their life. Second, places are intertwined with all the life course events that we experience, all the transitions, all the trajectories that individuals develop in later life. The third point, I think, is also extremely important here, that societal level processes, structures, values, and norms flow through places, and therefore shape people and their relationship to places. And finally, that people's relationship with places mediates human development or personal development. So place then shapes the life course. So Kieran brings together a really massive amount of literature here to make an argument. There are real opportunities to actually move this part of life course studies forward with infusing place, foregrounding place into life course studies. And he suggests that use of place and the performance of place, or how people contribute to the performance of places, is one. That the historical and social cultural meaning of places and how that affects the life course is another. And Kieran, I'm sorry if I'm not explaining your model very well here. That linked lives happen not only, in some life course sphere, they happen across space and time. And they evolve with the evolution of places and spaces. And that biographical trajectories and attachments to place are extremely important. And all of these are interrelated and actually influence key life course decisions. And that's, of course, one of the pillars of life course, the life course perspective. And they all flow together in this dynamic sort of way and influence human development. So I think that this is a huge, I'm not trying to embarrass you, Kieran, but I think this is a huge step forward. I mean, it's a really gutsy sort of chapter you've written. And so he proposes some gaps. So what do we do with this? Well, he suggests that we need to focus on diverse populations and diverse contexts using these ideas. People who are displaced, homeless, living nomadic lives, people are living in lower and middle income countries. We further need to unpack the trajectory of people's lives in places and across places. And he proposes in particular that we think about residential life courses and how those relate to other understandings of the life course as a way to get at that. He also suggests that there's an interesting potential here for looking at technology as something that's important when we think about place in the life course. There's a lot of linkages there to consider. And finally, that we just need people to conceptually and empirically foreground place in the life course and start to carry out studies that have really, that don't overlook place like a lot of life course studies have. And I just wanted to mention that there is, related to Kieran's sort of suggestions here, that we have a chapter in the book by Mark Rosenberg and his 3 co-authors who are from Latin America, China, and Sub-Saharan Africa, who suggest something similar in that they say that people, especially in lower and middle income countries, are often aging with places that are aging, with aging infrastructure that have particular needs and particular challenges that we often overlook because we don't think about place in that dynamic sort of life course way. So in summary, these are the things that we've talked about today. What I've tried to do is suggest particular themes that I think are somewhat novel, underutilized, particularly important in this time, and I think going forward. And if you don't take anything else away, place is a complex process. It's dynamic. There are different ways to get at that. These themes are all about that. They're all trying to get at that dynamic relationship with place and how it's reconstituted over and over and over again with the idea of trying to make older adult lives and experiences better. Now, obviously, there are more issues than that. A lot more issues in social gerontology, in gerontology writ large, but also in geographical gerontology. So those were my selections. That's my bias. Those are my interests that I think might be valuable to you. And I think your supervisors and you, if you want to use any of these ideas, can discuss which might be the most valuable. But I want to make a larger point here. I came up with this slide before any of the lectures today, but I had a feeling that some of these things might be covered in their interest of my co-authors or the authors in the book, but their interests of mine, that we all know that these are important. Precarity and social inclusion or exclusion in later life. Later life in lower and middle income countries, and cultural diversification in our thinking. We need more of that. These are important issues. Racism, ageism, disablement, other inequalities. These continue to be huge issues. Immigrants, integration, and work in later life. All of these huge, big issues that cut across all of gerontology are intersecting with all these themes and dynamics of place and aging. So there are connections here between the themes and these larger issues, and they're just waiting to be taken up by you guys. And all of us, really, and I think that there's just tremendous opportunities. So I think we need to continue our efforts to develop theory and methods to address this complexity of place, but we also need to connect to policy and practical matters. So there's a lot of applied potential in these ideas from my point of view. I think, in other words, these ideas have practical or applied value. And just to say again, like others have said, better inclusion of older people in these efforts is really essential. So I want to encourage all of you to become more critical and transdisciplinary in your thinking. That's what this program is all about. You've heard it before. I just want to echo that. I'd like to encourage you to use any of these ideas in your work. And I really want to wish you the best in your personal journeys through your doctoral programs and through your projects. I think it's exciting days and years ahead for you. And I'm really happy to be part of this with you. Thank you.
So thank you, Malcolm, who has given us so much food for thought and ongoing reflection and application, potential for application, for applied application. I thought I'd have to remember that myself for the future. We're almost down to the wire in terms of time, but if there are some quick questions or comments, Malcolm is here for a few minutes. Yes, Catalina, please. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Only some interesting question. On the last video, the last slide, you could show us some people who has a problematic face and problematic life condition. Why did you choose them? And why did you not mention to us some, how can I say, like rich people, talented people, economists, politicians? Why did you choose only these problematic person?
Yeah.
Like places? Thank you.
That's a fair question. On the earlier slide, those other photos were quite well-to-do people. Here, I wanted to point out the idea of that we need to help people that need more help. I wanted to suggest that especially people that live in lower and middle income countries, their quality of life may be very good, but we know, for example, in the social economic presentation today, that there are inequalities. And I wanted to point out that there are inequalities that I think just not to forget them. But I also see a lot of integrity in these people. I see in their faces, I see people who I perceive are living through relative hardship compared to myself, but they have a lot of dignity. So I wanted to show those photos for that reason as well.
And I believe thank you, Malcolm. I believe there's another question, am I right? Did I see somebody else put their hand up? No, maybe I misunderstood. Okay. Are there any other comments or questions? Yes, please go ahead. So just wait for the microphone, maybe. Yeah. Okay. So while we're getting the microphone to you, we'll come to the question online, please. Christine, what is it?
May I kindly ask why communities or neighbours would take more important role for older persons with dementia in the future trend instead of sitting in a place?
May I kindly ask
Why communities or neighbours take more dementia future trend?
Why will they?
Why was that? Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think policy is moving that way. I think to allow people with dementia, even though they have challenges navigating place sometimes, or having the same experience in place sometimes, I think we're coming to some agreement that allowing engagement in a neighborhood or a community is important to them. It's really important. But there's also, I think, another dynamic that it's also more cost effective potentially. So I think there are various motivations or ways of thinking about that. But I would invite, if I'm answering the question correctly, is there anyone in the audience that would like to comment on that? I mean, it's more about why should we put someone in a dementia care facility if they can live at home? I think we believe that home is preferred.
You have a comment here? Yeah. Yes, please. Just wait 1 moment for the microphone. Yeah.
Maybe I can add something in a health perspective. With the dementia disease, it's not very recommended to change the place of home and the surroundings because there's a lot of risk of making the dementia speed up in a worse way. So this is also the health perspective preference.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll come to our question here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. And coming from an urban studies background, these discussions about place always happen, especially around neighborhoods and how people identify a neighborhood is always based on activity-based things rather than how planners see a neighborhood. But I guess the difficulty is in that translation of, okay, everyone says their neighborhood's X, Y, and Z zone, but we only have these wards on a map, and that's how money is, translated. And so I guess, do you have any examples or suggestions for how we can translate that into policy? I guess those like place-based understandings, you can still, you know, accumulate them, and often they do overlap, but different groups, different things anyway.
So I think your question is sort of methodological. How do we actually define neighborhoods that work? And you know, for both urban planning and for older adults, for example. Yeah. That's a highly debated question. I've actually published some work on this, suggesting a different way to define neighborhoods. It's not just for older adults, it's more for analysis, but that are more meaningful neighborhoods. I don't think we have any agreement on that yet. I just read a paper the other day using a model called T neighborhoods, where we use street data, street networks to define the logical sort of boundaries of neighborhoods. But there are perceptual dimensions to this. There are the activity space dimensions. There are the social composition effects of neighborhoods. So social class, for example. There's amenity-based ways of thinking about neighborhoods. Where are the amenity centers? They all have strengths and weaknesses. And I think we just haven't figured that out yet. I think that's one of those ongoing issues. I don't know if there ever will be a really good solution to that. I think we need to maybe overlay different versions of those to come to some middle ground about, okay, if we want to think about what's important here to older adults in a particular community, activity, maybe safety, maybe amenities, combine them together, find the middle ground, find the space. There are ways to do spatial analysis that you can do that. And then you come up with something that's sort of an approximation of what's the best combination of those things. But we'll never have a perfect science of that, I don't think.
So we thank Malcolm for a really thought-provoking presentation and for an interesting Q&A. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you. Just before I hand over to Kira myself, my own observation at the end of this session with Malcolm and with Nora, but with all of the other sessions as well, it's really affirming and encouraging to hear the emphasis that everybody places on ensuring that we empower and hear the voices of older people and how we go about doing that in terms of research, policy and activism. But I think there's a huge challenge in terms of doing that effectively. And we probably need as much attention on how you do that as on the actual focus of this current project in terms of place as a concept and all that we've had to say about it today. So hopefully that'll be part of our work in the future. Thank you all very much, and hand over to Kieran.
Thanks very much, Patricia. And it's really just to say at the end of today, and it's the first, again, this public lecture, just how wonderful all the different contributions were. And they really managed to do so much more than what we envisaged. And I just feel I should say, and thanks Malcolm for the kind words, but I have no recollection of writing any of that. The only thing is I couldn't get the bloody arrow to attach to the diagram, and I think you would do it for me. So without any kind of further extension of the day's events, I think we can be reassured that this is a really good start to this public lecture series. And the recordings will be on the website at some point. And if you have any questions for those online or those who are yet to be connected to the network, please do come and contact us. So thank you very much. I am going to hold some of the people here just for a few minutes, just in relation to tomorrow. But other than that, we close the public session. So thank you very much for all your contributions. Thank you.